Hello, everyone. Welcome to the seventh Arwa lecture series. We'll just be waiting a few minutes before we introduce our speakers for today. Just wait for more people to be with us in the beginning of this lecture. Our speaker today is Professor Anthony Sinclair from University of Liverpool. He's a professor of archaeological methods and theory at the Department of Archaeology, Classics, and Egyptology. He got his BA, MA, and PhD from Cambridge University. His specialty is in archaeological research, prehistoric period, and he has wide publications spanning many continents and with field work in the Arabian Peninsula in particular that relates to our lecture series. His interests include landscape archaeology and hominin dispersal in the Pleistocene. He undertaken survey work at the Macbenscat World Heritage Site in northern South Africa since 2006, and also along the Red Sea coast in Saudi Arabia. Also has an interest in the development of archaeology as a discipline and implications for teaching the next generation of archaeologists. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome our speaker today, who will be talking to us about future directions for investigating the archaeological record of the Pleistocene in Saudi Arabia. The floor is yours, Professor Sinclair.
Thank you, Abdullah, and thank you for such a kind introduction. I'm very pleased to be here and to be able to speak to you today. I'm going to give you a sort of overview of how I see Pleistocene. So that's archaeology from about 2.5 million years ago through to about 10,000 years ago, and how that has both developed in Saudi Arabia and the sorts of questions that have been asked of the archaeological record, the information that we've picked up, and then look at some of the issues for knowledge that we still don't know and what we might wish to try and achieve in the next spate of archaeological fieldwork. The key thing, I suppose, is that Saudi Arabia and the Arabian Peninsula as a whole is a tremendously important area for understanding Pleistocene archaeology. It's to do with the relationship between Arabia and Africa and our understanding that hominins, so species that have the first word homo, like Homo sapiens or Homo erectus, will always have dispersed from Africa. Their origin is in Africa and they must disperse outwards to other parts of the world. Saudi Arabia has been subject to, I suppose, two major programs of work. The first one, which I'll talk about in a moment, is the initial comprehensive survey of the kingdom. And then there has been a great body of work that has taken place from about 2010 onwards, looking at sites along the Red Sea and in the interior. And I'll discuss how both of those have progressed. And then I want to come back and think about some of the questions. Can we answer some of the first questions that the comprehensive survey has raised? And what sort of questions remain present for the future? And then I'll spend the latter half, I suppose, looking at that in particular. So let's start with the first work on the Paleolithic or the Pleistocene archaeology of Saudi Arabia. And when I talk to my students about this, it is always extraordinary to be able to say that Saudi Arabia was surveyed comprehensively in the late 1970s and early 1980s. Many countries would be amazed at being able to do that sort of work. And this was undertaken by a series of teams going out and studying large regions. So you can see from the image in front of you that Saudi Arabia was divided up into 6 regions, 3 down the western coast, and then 3 from the center across to the east. And survey teams set out in many cases in places where there weren't roads, so in jeeps, in fact, even on camels at certain times, and did initial surveys walking across the landscape to try and find material. They weren't looking specifically for Pleistocene archaeology on its own, but covered the whole of the archaeological record for Saudi Arabia. And the comprehensive survey project revealed huge numbers of artifacts that are defined as being Acheulean in age or Middle Paleolithic. And they're defined as those time periods on the basis of the form, the shape in which the artifacts take. For those not familiar with them, Acheulean are, in a sense, teardrop-shaped tools that have been worked on both sides. They are often start from an initial lithic raw material starting point, and you remove flakes from one side and the other. Middle Paleolithic assemblages are usually determined on the basis that there is a core which has been prepared, and then a flake of a particular shape has been removed from that core, and that flake is then modified to provide a tool of a particular form. And both Acheulean and Middle Paleolithic assemblages are quite distinctive in their form, and so they can be identified from looking at the shape of the pieces that you find. And when the survey teams worked their way across the regions, they would usually do either 2 or 3 survey seasons in each region. They have found great concentrations of artifacts in the northwestern region, in the western region, and the southwestern region, numbers in the northern region, and some around the coasts of the eastern region. The central region is largely empty in terms of the material that they were not able to find. They identified a couple of places where there looked like there were landscapes of material, and both of those are to be located in the western region at the Wadi Fatima and at Doadmi. And in the northern region, they identified a site that might have material that is older than Acheulean, that is of a type of technology that we would call older one. When the comprehensive survey team is working in the late 1970s and early 80s, they were really doing a quick survey. And the key issues for Pleistocene archaeology is that it was almost impossible to get samples through which one would be able to give an absolute date for any of these localities or sites that they found. And in the late 1970s and early 1980s, in which this work took place, our understanding of paleoclimates was very different to what it is today. So I remember I was a student in the early 1980s, and our understanding of paleoclimates were that the world changed from glacial to interglacial periods on a long sequence, a long cycle. And if one lived in high latitudes, so let's say Europe, for example, or down in parts of southernmost parts of Africa, for instance, we would be looking at time periods when ice would build up on land and you would have glacial deposits, versus times in which those would melt and we would have a climate that was similar to what it is today. Our understanding at the time was that in the central part, in low latitudes, what we'd be looking at would be cycles of arid periods versus more humid periods. But it's fair to say that it was a very general sense of climate change, and our understanding of how humans or hominins might have responded to that was that they were largely at the mercy of, they responded to those broad changes because they themselves in their lived lives would not have experienced any sense of change. Now, since that comprehensive survey happened, there have been a number of significant developments in Pleistocene archaeology that have really changed the way in which we see Saudi Arabia, and has raised Saudi Arabia and Arabia as a whole up to the top, in a sense, of places in which we might wish to look for Pleistocene archaeology. And the first aspect of that is that as fossil evidence has built up and archaeological evidence has built up, and specifically as genetic evidence has been acquired, it has become very clear that Africa is the original place for the evolution of all of the species of the Homo genus. So we're looking at things such as Homo erectus, the archaic Homo sapiens, Homo neanderthal in northern latitudes in Europe, probably, and modern Homo sapiens. It's worth thinking here that the work in Africa starts in the mid-1960s or so. So there was still only about 15 years worth of work when the comprehensive survey happened. There has been tremendous work in Africa to expand the fossil and archaeological evidence since the early 1980s, but the pattern has always remained that Africa seems to be the origin for all species of Homo. The genetic evidence starts really from 1987, when we start to collect samples of mitochondrial DNA from modern humans, and that reinforces a clear belief that Africa is the original place in which modern humans, Homo sapiens, have evolved. And the material that we have for ancient DNA is really quite localized and much more recent in nature in terms of the genus Homo, but it certainly doesn't in any way contradict with that idea that Africa is the natural place. When we look at some of that genetic evidence, one of the things that it also suggests to us is that human populations were in many times contracted into small geographically isolated populations. And we can see in places that they are both present and absent across time in some of the higher latitudes. And so we're thinking about Homo as a species that disperses on multiple occasions with either contractions of population or probably quite likely local extinctions of population. So we're not talking about one single dispersal event, but we are trying to understand multiple dispersal events from Africa. And if you read any paper that has been published in the last 15 years about the Pleistocene archaeology of Arabia, the first thing that they will talk about is that Arabia is the first step away from Africa. And Arabia is a place to which humans might have been able to get relatively easily. I'll show you a slide a little bit later about where they might have come. It's worth saying for those of you who keep up with the most modern literature that there is a bit of a debate going on at the moment as a result of some early finds in places like Syria and in China about whether there may have been an evolution of human species outside of Africa, but that is a view that's held by a very small number of people at the moment. So just to give you a sense of those early sorts of sites. So this map shows the earliest sites that we know of outside of Africa at the moment. The sites that are identified in blue writing are older than 2 million years, and the sites that are identified in red are younger than 2 million. And the reason why I've separated those two out is that the ones that are younger are often related to that Acheulean technology, but they can certainly post-date the known original date we have for Homo erectus in Africa, which is approximately 1.96 million years at the moment. Whilst those blue sites tell us that hominins are getting out of Africa, and in the case of China, getting some distance out of Africa from really quite early ages. When we think about modern humans themselves, we used to imagine that the original date for modern humans was probably about 150,000 years, and it was from then onwards that they left Africa. We are now beginning to find, such as in Greece, examples of modern human skeletal remains that are older than that date. And so modern humans will also have dispersed from Africa on multiple occasions. The other interesting thing that has come up recently is that when we are looking particularly at the higher latitudes in Europe, we have periods, shall we say, of occupation, and periods when there's little there, when there are significant climatic events that effectively remove hominins from a European landscape. And one of those happens around about 1.1 million years ago. And it is interesting that when we start to look at some of the Pleistocene archaeology, the Acheulean or the bifacial technology that we see after that is often in many cases more sophisticated, more elaborately made. Now, I mentioned that people usually think of Arabia as the first step out of Africa, and it's in a sense an initial line for many papers. pretty much all papers I think you'll find in the last 15 years. And for many talks, I myself have written that same line several times and so on. This is a slide that comes from the Smithsonian Museum. They've done work in China, and so they're looking at the dispersal of the earliest hominins from Africa. And the wavy lines, the lines of dispersal, give you that immediate sense of seeing Arabia as being the first place that people might go to from Africa. And you can see in this particular case, this slide was probably created round about 2010 or so. There are two possible routes that people imagine that hominins may have come into Arabia from, one of which would be going up from Eastern Africa. We usually think of Eastern Africa as being the place in which hominin species have most likely evolved. So they would move northwards, probably following something like the Nile corridor, which would give you a relatively wet landscape to go through the arid area of Northern Africa. And then they would cross into Arabia and elsewhere at a northern route across the Sinai into the Near East. The other possibility, of course, is that they might go out of the Horn of Africa from somewhere like modern-day Ethiopia or Eritrea, and they would then go into modern-day Yemen or the southern part of Saudi Arabia and go in that way. And so those are two possible routes, both of which would make Arabia still the first place in which hominins would leave Africa. So when archaeological work really takes off in terms of Pleistocene archaeology in the 2010s, when researchers managed to, in a sense, sell to their funding bodies that Arabia is the place that people should really be engaged in, one of the things that they're doing is they're looking at that wealth of material that was collected by the complete archaeological survey, the comprehensive survey in the 70s and 80s, which is dated typologically. And what we want to know is, can we give it some absolute dates? Can we go beyond simply looking at the pieces and saying, what are the time periods for these sites? The second key thing is that Arabia today is an extraordinarily arid country or set of countries in places. And our key concern is, how have hominin species managed to deal with both arid and potentially more human environments? And our understanding of those environments has changed significantly in the late 80s and in particular during the 1990s. And during the 1990s, we get a wealth of climate data that comes from things like the ice core records from Greenland, as well as long sequences of climatic data from other places around the world. And it has shown us that climate change is not slow, steady cycles, but it has often happened in terms of very abrupt periods of change. And it's worth noting here that our concern with climate change today has led climate scientists to look at the climatic record of the Pleistocene as an analogue for what might happen as climates warm up today. And so not only are Pleistocene archaeologists interested in this period for climate change, but modern day climate scientists are, and they have devoted tremendous resources to understanding the nature of climatic change. In the case of Arabia, we're really dealing with obviously not ice sheets built up, but we're dealing with episodes of aridity, so having little, if any, water available in the landscape, through to periods of greater humidity, greater rainfall, and periods of places of running water or places where water is stable in the landscape, lake-type settings. The other thing that is worth bearing in mind through the Pleistocene is that as ice sheets have built up on land in the high latitudes, so that has removed water from the oceans. And so for most of the Pleistocene, the sea level has been lower than it is today. And the importance of that is that it reveals land that could be occupied by hominins that at the moment sits underwater. And so there are places where we cannot yet see evidence of hominin occupation, but which we might presume were places that would have been available to hominins in the past. So from about 2010, there are two major, in a sense, programs of work. I've been part of work that has taken place on the coastal regions, so regions 1 and 2 in this particular map in front of you. and working down in the southwest region in Jizan and Asya provinces, and out in Khorasan, but Khorasan is later than Pleistocene. And most recently, we have done some work up in the Gulf of Aqaba. And what drives, in a sense, our interest there is both the nature of Pleistocene archaeology, that southern route for dispersal into Arabia, but also that sense that coastal landscapes will have changed dramatically through the Pleistocene. And can we begin to understand those occasions when sea levels were lower and the landscape was larger for hominin application, for hominin life? In area 3 and 4 and 5, a team has looked at work in the arid desert environments. And obviously, because they are arid today, one of the things that they have been concerned with is how we can begin to understand how those places were different at times during the Pleistocene. And so they have done lots of work in terms of understanding paleoclimates, both in terms of temperatures and in terms of precipitation, so rainfall, and in terms of the movement of water. I'm going to start from the inland side to begin with, and then I'll look at the coastal side a little bit later. And we'll see there are similarities in terms of the pattern that the work here has produced. So I mentioned that the work inland, obviously, we don't believe that hominins are living in desert environments. Water is a significant factor that makes environments habitable, that enables hominins to survive. And so one of the first tasks of the group working in the inland has been, in a sense, to try and understand how climate change has affected the precipitation across Arabia. And so we're looking here at a series of slides produced by Richard Jennings and others in 2015. And they led to a term calling Arabia Green Arabia. And what was meant by that was that there were occasions of humid periods in which Arabia was considerably more humid, wetter than it is at present. And as a result of that, there would have been greater growth of plant foods and opportunities for animals to live off those plant foods and so forth. And the factors that are causing those, that greater humidity, relate to patterns of rainfall caused by either the winds coming across the northern part of Africa and making their way across the Red Sea into Arabia, which doesn't happen today, but may have happened in the past. Changes in the Indian monsoon, which at the moment is held back to the southern part of Oman, but which in the past would have moved further north, and indeed to some of the precipitation that would have blown in from the Atlantic across the Mediterranean and gone across the east of the Near East and into the northern part of Saudi Arabia. So there have been periods when Arabia has been significantly greener than at present. And if we want to look at the effects of that precipitation on the landscape itself, work has been done using satellite photography, and from that to identify old ancient river channels that would have been the places of flowing water during times of greater humidity. So this is work by Paul Breeze and others. And what you can see in this area is that across parts of Arabia that are now extraordinarily arid, there were major river channels that collected water, in a sense, from rain across the escarpment, running down north, south, roughly, on the western part of Arabia, and then flowing out into the Arabian Gulf. And it's very interesting when one looks at some of those sites that were located by the comprehensive survey, and you can see in this particular image here that they can now be located next to those drainage channels. And the set of photographs in the left-hand side is work by Paul Breeze and others going to places upon that landscape to see whether what they have identified from the aerial photographs actually is what we can see on the landscape itself. And that's been the case. The other sort of thing that this modeling of the paleohydrology of Arabia has done is that it's identified old lake basins, so places where there would have been standing water for a length of time. And one of the first sort of areas would be the Juba Lakes, the Paleo Lake site up in the northern part of Saudi Arabia, which has been the subject for a great deal of work. Finally, on the right-hand side, you can see a couple of graphs, and what they're looking at there is the distance of sites of a particular age, defined by their typology, from the nearest major water source or water basin. And you can see that in the lower Paleolithic, so we're talking here roughly probably about older than 500,000 years or so ago, hominins are pretty much tied to being close to water. So most of the sites go up to at most about 30 or 40 kilometers away from a water source. And we might imagine that that is a distance that could be covered within a day or at most a couple of days. If we look at the graph above, we can see that middle Paleolithic sites have a greater spread of sites further away, particularly, I suppose, from 40 kilometers through to 60 kilometers. There are more of them. And the difference there is that middle Paleolithic hominins would appear to be able to take water with them, and they'll be able to take water with them to last over a series of days. This is not a pattern that is unique to Arabia. It's been observed in South Africa. So it's a consistent feature that we see with hominin behavior. The Juba lakes have been identified as being places of standing water. And when Mike Petraglia and his team went to look, once we know that that is a place where hominins might have found resources, the archaeological evidence comes up very clearly. And so a whole series of sites have been identified at a series of paleo lakes. And now we have evidence of hominin occupation by these paleo lakes going back to around about 400,000 years ago. And in the photograph in the bottom here, we're looking at material that's been dated to about 55,000, 125,000, 200, 300, 400,000 years or so. And Mike Petraglia and his team have reasonably argued that what we're looking at here are hominins being able to go and use this landscape because it has become greener as a result of the humid climate that exists at these moments in time. And this is evidenced very nicely by this particular graph from Hugh Grocut's paper in 2021. And here they're looking at a series of dated lake sediments from one particular site in the Juba Lakes area. And this is the one that shows that there are lake sediments present from 400,000, 300,000, 200, 125, 55, and so on. Essentially, whenever there is water there, there are hominins that are active by the lakeside. There's also a sense that hominins need to be close to sources for their stone tools, their raw materials that way. And if you've ever carried quantities of stone tools across a landscape in landscape survey, you'll understand that they're pretty heavy and you don't want to carry them very far. So that makes sense of that particular aspect of the work. Astoundingly, some of the work at another of the paleo lakes, so at Al Wustra for this bone here, and at the paleo lake of Alathar for a series of footprints, has given us both direct evidence for the presence of hominins. So at Al Wustra, we have a finger bone, probably something like a second phalange of the hand. And this has been dated by association with the sediments to about 85,000 years ago. And at Alathar, we have a series of footprints that are from both animal species and from human species. And these are dated from the sediments to about 125,000 years ago. Both of those two sorts of dates would fit in with humid periods in that part of Saudi Arabia itself. So if we look at the Red Sea, and this is work that I've been involved in myself, this is an area where the Comprehensive Archaeological Survey identified quite a number of locations where they found both bifacial stone tools, Acheulean type stone tools, as well as prepared core, middle Paleolithic stone tools. You'll see here in these slides and in later ones that I call these Middle Stone Age, and that is to tie them into material of the same age in Africa on the other side of the Red Sea. My belief here is that since hominins are dispersing from Africa, we're really taking the language, or we should take the language from Africa to Arabia itself, rather than using a term that in fact primarily relates to assemblages that exist in Europe. But maybe we could talk about that a little bit later on. One of the things that we have in the southwest is that we have a series of raised shorelines that tell us about coastal areas at particular moments when the sea level was actually higher than it is at present, so we can observe what was happening at the coast itself. And there are large deposits of basalt relating to volcanic eruptions and so forth, and basalt provides an enormous resource for lithics, and we have found material that exists there. The graph in the right tells us about the spread of size of those sites, and you can see that most of those sites are really small. They're telling us about small moments of hominin activity in a landscape, and the larger day length, week length sort of activities are fairly small in terms of the number of sites that we have found so far. I'm going to talk to you about a couple of sites that we've looked at through the course of our work, one of which is Wadi Dahaben, or Dahaben Quarry in the map on the left, and the other one is Wadi Dabsa, and they illustrate some of the aspects of the quality of the archaeological record here in this southwestern region. And the diagram I've shown on this particular slide at the bottom comes from the comprehensive survey, and during the comprehensive survey of this area, the survey team noted that some of these artifacts from the Pleistocene were associated, as far as they could see, with coastlines that were visible today. It's one of the reasons why I think the comprehensive survey program was an extraordinary piece of work for the time. Really amazing. So this is Wadi Dahaben, and in the image at the top you can see a road running down the bottom part of the aerial photographic image. The present day coast or shoreline is about 2 kilometers down below that road, so we're still relatively close to the shoreline itself. And you can see there are deposits here which are both coral deposits, fossilized coral deposits, and they would have been under the sea, close to the coast. And we can see that some of those coral deposits have overlying beach rock deposits, by which we mean they are fossilized beach deposits, so containing sands and rolled stones and so forth. The other thing to see about this particular site is that it's a site that has had quite a lot of work done to it in recent years, both primarily for the removal of materials that are possibly went to help make the road for other forms of building work. And this is a site that I will refer back to later on as being a site that is, in a sense, a fragile site in terms of how we might manage Paleolithic heritage in Saudi Arabia. Down the bottom right, you can see a picture, and in the picture by where the scale is, we're looking at an archaeological artifact, a stone tool, and it's been embedded within the beach rock deposits. And this is telling us about hominins being active at the beach itself. We have dates for this particular site that suggest to us that the hominins are here between about 130 to 85,000 years ago, and that ties in with the last interglacial or a humid period in Saudi Arabia. Here's a site that is slightly different. So this is the site of Wadi Dabsa, and we're further away from the modern day coastline, probably something of the order of 20 kilometers or so. You can see it in the bottom right-hand aerial photograph or satellite photograph. It comes from Google Earth, of course. The blue arrow is pointing to Wadi Dabsa itself, and you can see it in the panoramic photo at the top. It's the lighter area surrounded by a series of basalt flows. And the wonderful thing about Wadi Dabsa is it preserves a series of particular deposits, tufa deposits, that are precipitates that are created from standing water when it disappears. We've done work both mapping the local topography and collecting material from Wadi Dabsa itself. It's the site that has the most materials that we have found in the southwest. And work by my colleague Robin Inglis has shown that the pattern of materials across the site itself is dependent on the local topography, on the ridges and the slopes on the site itself. So that if the material sits on the ridge, it stays pretty much in its original place of deposition. And as the slope begins to increase, so the material is moving downslope. In the central figure, you'll see there are a whole series of black squares and blue squares. For that major square, L0130, we've not collected any material from that. And that's a deliberate decision to leave material at a site for researchers working in the future. Now, last year, one of our colleagues, a lady called Abby Stone, who has done dating work of the tufas, has shown that the Wadi Dabsa and the deposits that we have there can be given a date through its tufa to what we would call middle marine isotope stage 7, so around about 200,000 years ago, and marine isotope stage 5, so roughly between about 125 and about 85,000 years ago. So Wadi Dabsa is also a site that is occupied during those humid periods. It's similar to what we see in the inland areas, and it's similar to what we see in terms of age at Wadi Dahaban. Finally, just to give you a sense of the final bit of work we've done, in our last visit, we worked up along the Gulf of Aqaba, both along the Gulf itself and then down on the most northerly part of the Red Sea coast of Saudi Arabia. And I want to show you a couple of sites just to give you a sense of the material that is available there. Neither of these two have yet been dated, but they give you a sense of the variety of work that exists. So this is locality 007. Actually, let me just show you. So that's down here in the southern part. And then final one we'll look at is up here, about halfway up the Gulf of Aqaba itself. And we're looking at a middle Stone Age or a prepared core flake in the top. And you can see that the negative flake surfaces are relatively easy to see and the edges are still relatively crisp. This is an object that will have been on the surface for more than 100,000 years, but in that time, it's still retained some of its features for quite to enable it to be identified quite clearly. The one we're looking down at the bottom, which actually to a normal eye might look like a rounded pebble, is in fact one of these bifacial tools, and we can see that some of the negative flake scars are very heavily eroded. And that tells us something about the length of time it must have been sitting on the surface. Now, artifacts of that type can also be in other places. So this is L006, halfway up the Gulf of Aqaba, and we're looking at a site that sits probably something of the order of 25 meters above modern day sea level, possibly more, on a flat surface. And there we have found a whole series of bifacial tools, most of which are in remarkably good condition. So despite the fact they have been sitting on the surface here, because they are not close to the movement of the sea in and out and so forth, the environment has not had such an enormous effect in terms of erosion upon these pieces. The other really interesting thing about these pieces is the variety of raw materials from which they are made. And these materials come from a whole range of different locations, most of which we've not yet been able to identify clearly, but it's telling us about pieces that people, hominins at this time, are able to carry with them. And we normally think of these bifacial tools as being more general purpose tools, tools that can be put to a whole variety of uses. So they are the sorts of things that you might carry with them. There are some scholars who think that they also provide sources of flakes for sharp cutting as cores and so on. So if we reflect back on what's happened in those two programs of work, one of the questions that it wanted to look at was to say, can we date Pleistocene archaeology in Saudi Arabia? And the work that's happened in the last 15 years has been very successful at that. It's identified a whole series of primarily previous locations in the landscape that had water, whether they be paleo lakes or shorelines, and we find hominins present at periods when the humidity has been greater, and in places where we can look at that across time. So in the inland region, whenever the climate is more humid, hominins are present at those locations. And we've also found both that direct evidence for Homo, almost certainly Homo sapiens about 85,000 years ago, and some indirect evidence for the genus Homo, probably also Homo sapiens, I would guess, about 125,000 years ago. Have we been able to understand how hominins are dealing with Pleistocene paleo environments and how the climates have affected them? Only partially, I think we've managed to answer that question. We've managed to answer the bit where it says, if there's water around, are hominins present? The answer is clearly yes. But one of the key issues I would suggest with looking at Pleistocene archaeology is that those places in the landscape that are different at times of greater humidity are the ones that we have been able to date most easily. They're ones that we have been able to identify most easily. And so the reason why I've put a question mark by the yes here is to identify the fact that the evidence base that we have is probably not yet picking up those time periods of greater aridity. And we need to think about that. Have we answered the question of how hominins are dealing with coastal environments? Yes, to a certain extent, because the coastal environments that we can see today, which is a small fraction of the coastal environments that would have existed, the ones that we can look at today are ones when the sea level was higher. Hominins are there and active by the coasts. But once again, we don't see much beyond that. So what sort of questions might we want to be looking at for the future in Saudi Arabia? Well, if you think back to that initial map where I gave you a series of sites that were dated to older than 2 million or not much younger than 2 million, in Saudi Arabia at the moment, we haven't really found anything that's older or can be reliably dated to being older than 400,000 years ago. Does that mean that humans were not there then? I think that is extraordinarily unlikely. If they weren't there from 400,000 to 2.4 million years ago, that would be an absolutely extraordinary thing that we would have to explain. But I think the likelihood is we're not yet able to look at landscapes of that period that have datable material. That's a key factor. The second sort of thing is that the archaeology that we have been able to date is usually tied to those places that have standing water at times of humidity. And the question is, where are the hominins in cases where it is arid? Have they left Arabia? That's a possibility. Or are there other places in Arabia that they might be that we haven't yet managed to look at? The question of whether hominins came into Arabia through a northern route, having gone up the Nile corridor, or a southern route, actually still remains open, for the simple fact that the quantity of evidence we have is still relatively small. And the final thing I want to raise with you is the question of how we manage and explore Pleistocene heritage assets for the future. So let's look at some of that earlier evidence. And this comes from a couple of places that we looked at in southwestern Saudi Arabia, where we have found a couple of pieces that would suggest that they are older than 400,000. They haven't been claimed to be older than 400,000 because the dates that I've cited here for Jebel Aqaba at about 450,000 years ago, or at Wadi Jizan at about 800,000 years ago, are based on the dating of basalt deposits, but not from these exact locations. If we can assume that the basalt flows in these particular areas happened at one single time period, then these particular artifacts would give us our first glimpse of hominins having been present in Saudi Arabia before that 400,000 year marker point. And in the case of the cleaver that we can see on the right-hand side, really quite considerably before that time period. It's worth saying that finding locations like this is an extraordinary rarity in terms of Saudi Arabian archaeology, and indeed archaeology in the world in general. The places where we have been most successful at that in Eastern Africa are places where these sorts of deposits are much larger and have been more identified, and they're more exposed and have been known to be like that over decades, allowing research to happen. But to give you a sense of the quality of material that we might work from, this is a paper by Ian Stelton and colleagues, and on the western side of Saudi Arabia, you can see that in the Arabian Shield area, there are a great number of basalt deposits, quaternary basalts. And if we look at the diagram on the right-hand side, a number of those deposits, the ones that have been highlighted in orange on the left and the band in orange on the right-hand side, date between 0 and 2.5 million years ago. So we have a series of deposits that we could date that might give us the beginnings of a window into that earlier time period. And the extraordinary thing about basalt landscapes are often used by hominins, is that the soils that develop above them are affected by the chemistry of the basalts that exist below them. And they are particularly rich in terms of nutrients, providing a good vegetational landscape and a good landscape for animal communities above them. They also provide a rugged landscape, so a landscape that controls the movement of animals, and from a hominin perspective, makes it more difficult for us to be eaten by carnivores. And that's quite useful. But those basalt landscapes are complicated. So once again, we're looking here at the Wadi Dabsa, and you can see it's the beige colored block in the middle here. And all of the red area is flows of basalt. And you can see here at the Wadi Dabsa that there are approximately 6 cinder cones. So these are the sources from which the basalt flows happen. And so there are a whole series of basalt flows that have happened over time, which now interleave or overlap each other across the Wadi Dabsa landscape. It offers a great opportunity if we can begin to date those individual flows. And work has suggested that the individual flows can be identified chemically. Different basalt flows from different eruptions from cones have a different chemical signature. But it also tells us about the complexity of the work that's involved in the future in order to be able to understand the detail of that dating sequence. Other sorts of evidence that tells us that hominins ought to be available or present in Saudi Arabia comes from work from climate records that derive from speleothems that exist in caves in Oman and Yemen, and work by Nicholson recently has shown that we can identify humid periods going back to 1.1 million years ago. And if we were to extrapolate from that, we should be able to predict that hominins have been present in Arabia right the way up to 1.1 million years ago. So that gives us hope to look for older material. Where are hominins during arid periods? In northern latitudes, at times of glacial growth, we like to think that hominin communities are restricted to refuge areas, areas where more amenable resources are present. And at times of aridity, we might think about there being refuge areas in Arabia itself. A number have been identified, and claimed over on the eastern side. So this comes from a paper by a lady called Matoi Kukova in 2023. And she's identifying that area G over in Oman as being a refuge area that would have existed during the last glacial maximum, probably around about 20,000 years ago. Look at the area D, which is the southern part of the Red Sea, and we'll go and look at there in a little bit more detail. So this is a slide usually presented by my colleague, Jeff Bailey. And one of the things he wants to put in your mind is the way in which, for most of the time, if we take our sea level back to the current sea level, the underlying dark blue is the sea level through most of human history. And his argument is that for 95% of the time that humans have been around on the planet, sea level has been lower. And so there are landscapes that are now underwater that we simply cannot see that would have been available to hominids at different times in the past. What might that mean down in the southern Red Sea area? So my colleague Jeff Bailey and others, so Denis Sakalariou from the center in Athens, have done work looking at the nature of the coastline that would have been exposed in this particular case when the sea level was at its lowest. We know that the sea level was approximately 120 or nowadays about 130 meters below present at the last glacial maximum. And this is the area of land that would have been exposed. So, for example, the Farasan archipelago of islands that now sits in the Red Sea would have been on land itself at the time period. You can also see there are a series of lakes that exist in the northern part of this, and these are places where the ground goes down below 130 meters, and so there would have been places of standing water. Jeff and Dennis have done surveys of a couple of areas, area one at the edge of the shoreline as we might have predicted it at the last glacial maximum, and the second one, area two, at a place that they think of as having a water channel at the same time period. So let's have a brief look. So this is at the edge of the coast where the sea shoreline would have been 25 to 30,000 years ago. And we can see that it's not a straight, simple beach line into the sea itself, but just as it is in many places, it's a mixture of small islands and channels and so forth. And we know from studies looking at these areas today that these would have been extraordinarily rich areas of resources that would have been attractive to hominin communities at the time. If we go inland, so this is a drainage channel that we can see on that coastal plain area, and the dark blue area at the top is what would have been a standing lake during the last glacial maximum itself. So both of those would have been places that would have been attractive to modern hominins. Where work has been done of this sort over longer periods of time in the North Sea to the east of the United Kingdom, fishing boats have brought up archaeological materials from this landscape that has now been revealed by surveys and so forth. And we can begin to talk about a history of the use of this submerged landscape because of the work that's happened there over tens of years. The other sort of thing is, have we been able to resolve that question of whether hominins come in through a southern or a northern corridor? The answer is no, not yet. But I would certainly say that the evidence still leaves open the possibility that hominins could relatively straightforwardly have crossed from the Horn of Africa, from Eritrea now is, across those expanded coastlines and across areas of islands, enabling them to see from one place to the next place to the next place, and so on. Finally, what about managing those Pleistocene heritage assets for the future? One of the things to remember is that Pleistocene archaeology in Saudi Arabia is remarkably young. Going back to the comprehensive survey, it's about 50 years old. And in that 50 years, we've learned an extraordinarily enormous amount of information. But there's still a lot to learn. The other sort of thing that exists is that when we look at surveys of archaeological landscapes, we pick up a big pattern very quickly, but getting the details of what goes on is something that is much more difficult. And one of the reasons for that is that when we're looking at the archaeological record, the Pleistocene, we're not looking at discrete sites. We're really trying to identify and interpret hominin activity across a landscape from people that are mobile. And so we're looking at individual depositions of artifacts that vary enormously in character across large landscapes. Now, in Saudi Arabia itself, some of those sites can look after themselves, and I would suggest that many of the sites in the arid interior these days can look after themselves because the aridity of that interior makes it a very unattractive place for modern humans these days to go and occupy those places. Others of those sites are fragile, and they're fragile because they exist in places where there are many modern humans living and where there is pressure for development in those areas. And obviously, of course, one can't hold back development for archaeology, but we need to think a little bit about how we can work those two together. The final thing I'll raise is whether we can build capacity for people to understand the landscape. So here, I've shown you this one before, but for example, Wadi Dahaban and Dabsa are in reality remarkably fragile sites, and they're fragile either because they present resources, so sands and gravels and so forth that can be used in modern day development, or they provide places where people might wish to go and make use of them next to built up areas very quickly. And so we need to think about how resources of that sort of character that might possess Pleistocene archaeology can be understood before archaeological survey, shall we say, and we might then be able to predict the impact of development upon those locations and make plans for how they should be treated. And in other parts of the world where this sort of process has taken place, in the UK, for example, Pleistocene archaeological sites happen in gravel quarries and on old river beds and so forth, places where material is taken for building. We've undertaken a process of landscape mapping and characterization of those deposits to create a predictive map for where we might find Pleistocene archaeology. And so we can use those predictions to suggest that archaeological work ought to be done in advance of impact, human modern impact upon those landscapes. The final sort of thing is it's worth looking back to that comprehensive archaeological survey that happened in the mid-1970s. And stories of the history of that tell us that one of the reasons why it could happen was in the 1970s, the first Saudi specialists with PhDs who had acquired their PhDs at universities abroad had come back to build a capacity for understanding the archaeology of Saudi Arabia. And that made a comprehensive survey possible. There are still relatively few Pleistocene or Paleolithic archaeologists in Saudi Arabia. My colleague Abdullah, who's the co-host of this particular seminar session, is one of the very few. And in order to understand the Pleistocene archaeology, we need to build up the capacity of people who actually live and work in Saudi Arabia to be able to go out and identify and make use of those deposits. And that might also mean alerting the public to their existence and providing them with information about the nature of those deposits, and perhaps even a capacity whereby they can report material they have found directly to people who can go and look at it. And one example of work that exists in places in Europe is that people have created visual online sources of information by which people can look at examples of Pleistocene artifacts to identify things that they see. And the obvious way to look at that will be to then develop some sort of online reporting such that when people see them, they might report them to somebody who can go and further look at them. So that's the end of the talk. I should thank a whole series of people who funded the work that we've done in Saudi Arabia, and also, of course, to the many people from the Commission for Heritage, or Heritage and Tourism as it used to be, over the many years that we ourselves and other teams have worked there. Their work has been invaluable in terms of helping us do that work. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Sinclair, for such an interesting and valuable presentation. And the floor is open to anyone who would like to ask a question.